It began with a sound that every homeowner dreads but few ever prepare for. The kind of pounding on a front door that rattles glass, shakes walls, and pierces straight into the gut like a warning siren. In that instant, I knew my peace was over. Something was coming, something vicious, and once it crossed the threshold, my quiet retirement would never be the same again. Before I dive into how this nightmare unfolded, let me ask you a small favor. If you enjoy true tales of HOA power gone wild, neighborhood corruption, and the kind of revenge that makes you lean forward in your chair, hit that subscribe button. It helps us share more unbelievable stories with you. And trust me, you won't want to miss how this one ends. The house had been my sanctuary for less than 3 months. A modest home tucked neatly inside Maple Ridge Estates. A community that had been advertised as serene, neighborly, and stress-free. The realtor's glossy brochures showed manicured lawns, tidy sidewalks, and smiling families. Picture-perfect neighborhood. What they didn't show was the hidden machinery of control, the Homeowners Association, run by a man who seemed to believe he was judge, jury, and executioner of suburban living. The day it all began, the morning sun had just started burning through the mist that clung to the cul-de-sac. I'd been sipping coffee, staring out at the perfectly aligned houses across the street, when the pounding came. 3 rapid booms against the door. Not the polite knock of a neighbor, but the forceful, chest-thumping strike of authority demanding obedience. I stood, heart thumping, as the noise came again, louder this time, followed by the crack of wood splintering under pressure. My instincts, honed from decades in courtrooms and a lifetime of knowing when something smelled wrong, screamed that this wasn't right. And then the door gave way. 3 men in crisp, matching polos stormed inside, their eyes hard, their voices barking accusations about violations. They shoved a paper into the air like it was a holy decree, shouting words like compliance and search authorization. The absurdity of it almost froze me in place. An HOA, an actual homeowners association, had just broken into my home as if they were a tactical police unit. Retirement was supposed to be quiet for me. 35 years of slugging it out in courtrooms had earned me a chance to breathe, to ride my Harley on open roads, to share beers and barbecues with my crew, the Iron Eagles. We weren't outlaws, not anymore. Just old men with scars, stories, and steel horses that still purred like they did decades ago. But as I watched those so-called HOA enforcers trample through my living room, I knew that the peace I had imagined for myself was gone. What began as petty notices had now escalated into a direct invasion. Started small, almost laughable. My garage was apparently the wrong shade of beige. My mailbox wasn't on the approved list. My trash cans had been visible from the street for 20 minutes too long. Annoyances, I thought. Nothing more than power games from a board president with a clipboard. I repainted, replaced, and rushed around, thinking cooperation would quiet them. But each time I complied, they found another target. Soon it was my hedges, trimmed to their liking one week, suddenly too tall the next. My bird feeder was ruled a nuisance. My Harley, my pride, my freedom, was deemed unsightly, as if a machine polished with more care than most people give their homes could possibly offend anyone. The violations stacked higher, the fines climbed steeper, and it became clear. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. The man behind it all was Leonard Barnes, the HOA president. A middle management burnout who had found in Maple Ridge Estates the kind of authority he'd never earned in the real world. He relished every petty enforcement, every dollar squeezed from homeowners, every ounce of fear he could instill with his notices. He'd taken one look at me, a leather-clad retiree with a Harley, and decided I didn't belong in his kingdom of beige conformity. The pounding on my door that morning was the culmination of weeks of harassment. And as those men paraded through my living room, snapping photos and scribbling notes, I realized that Barnes wasn't going to stop. Not with warnings, not with fines, not even with humiliation. His goal was simple: to push me out, to make an example of me, to tighten his grip on every resident by showing what happened to those who resisted. But he had underestimated me. Because unlike the quiet retirees he bullied, I wasn't alone. The Iron Eagles, Men who had once stood at the pinnacles of their fields stood with me. Wallace, who had worn the black robes of a state Supreme Court judge. Thomas, who had commanded corporate empires with a balance sheet in hand. Eric, who had served in the FBI's cybercrimes unit and still prowled the internet like a predator. Each of us had traded in our professions for chrome, leather, and the freedom of the open road. We were older, slower, grayer, but we were not beaten. When I looked back on that morning, I saw it clearly. Barnes had declared war. But he had chosen his enemy poorly. The violation letters were just the opening salvo. The raids, the fines, the intimidation, they were all weapons in a campaign to break me. Yet he had overlooked one thing. We weren't just men with motorcycles. We were men who had spent lifetimes fighting battles more dangerous, more vicious, and more ruthless than an HOA president could ever imagine. And if Barnes wanted a war, he was about to learn just how far the Iron Eagles would go to defend one of their own. As the HOA enforcers slammed my door shut behind them, leaving behind a fresh notice taped defiantly to the cracked frame, I stood in the wreckage of my once quiet living room. Sunlight filtered through the dust, glinting off the chrome of my Harley parked just inside the garage. My jaw tightened, my pulse steadied. I had been pushed far enough. This was no longer about a mailbox, a hedge, or even a Harley. This was about dignity, about the right to live without fear in the home I had worked a lifetime to earn. And in that moment, as I stared at the mocking words on that paper, I knew one thing for certain. Leonard Barnes had just lit a fire he could not control. And I wasn't going to fight this battle alone. The night air vibrated with the low thunder of engines as the Iron Eagles rolled in one by one, their headlights cutting through the quiet streets of Maple Ridge Estates. It was a scene that no brochure or realtor's promise could have prepared this neighborhood for. 5 Harley-Davidsons rumbling into a pristine suburban cul-de-sac where the loudest sound was usually a lawnmower or a barking dog. To the neighbors peering nervously from behind their blinds, it must have looked like a gang invasion. But to me, it was salvation. I had called them, not with words, but with the unspoken language we all understood. The sound of trouble too big to ignore. They arrived without hesitation. Wallace dismounted first, his old judge's posture still sharp even as age weighed on his joints. Thomas followed, calm as ever. His eyes scanning the scene like numbers on a spreadsheet he already knew how to balance. Eric was last, helmet in hand, the faint glow of a phone screen lighting his face as he typed furiously. No doubt already digging into HOA records before his boots hit the pavement. When they stepped into my living room and saw the cracked door frame, the scattered papers, and the violation notice taped defiantly to the splintered wood, none of them spoke. They didn't need to. Each man's expression hardened, the kind of silent agreement forged only in fire. Barnes had crossed a line, and in doing so, he had awakened something far stronger than his petty authority. We sat in the garage, the smell of motor oil and grilled steak lingering from the last weekend's barbecue. The bikes gleamed under fluorescent lights, polished chrome reflecting faces that had seen battles of every kind. Legal, corporate, criminal, personal. We weren't a gang, not anymore, but we were brothers bound by history, by loyalty, and now by a shared enemy. The first step was clarity. Barnes wanted control. He used petty fines and bogus rules as chains to shackle homeowners, bleeding them of money, patience, and dignity. But intimidation alone couldn't explain the aggression. Breaking into my house, parading through my living room like they owned it, that wasn't about compliance. That was desperation, which meant there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of Maple Ridge Estates, something worth protecting so viciously that Barnes had turned his HOA into an army. Eric, ever the investigator, promised to peel back the layers. His fingers moved like lightning across his phone, already probing public databases, cross-referencing shell companies, and mapping out connections. He muttered about financial inconsistencies, reserve funds that didn't match property conditions, and whispers of consulting firms with no real offices. Thomas leaned back, arms crossed, his mind already calculating. He had balanced billion-dollar ledgers and dismantled corporate frauds in his prime. To him, an HOA budget was child's play. If Barnes was stealing, Thomas would find the trail. Wallace, calm and deliberate, reminded us of the law. Even in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA president drunk on power, state law reigned supreme. Barnes could tape as many notices as he wanted to my door, but breaking and entering was still a crime. The challenge, Wallace explained, wasn't proving the wrongdoing. It was forcing the authorities to care. And in a town where favors and connections often weighed heavier than justice, that wouldn't be easy. I listened to them, each man slipping seamlessly back into his old role, as though no time had passed since their careers defined them. My heart swelled with both pride and urgency. Barnes thought he was fighting a tired retiree with no allies. Instead, he had declared war on a retired judge, a financial mastermind, a cyber sleuth, and a defense attorney who had made a career dismantling men exactly like him. The plan was simple in theory, complex in execution. Gather evidence, expose the fraud, and turn Barnes' own system against him. But there was risk. The HOA wasn't just Barnes. It was a board of followers, each one either complicit in his schemes or too intimidated to resist. And if Barnes had the audacity to send enforcers to smash through my door, we could only imagine what else he might try once he realized we were fighting back. That night stretched long, the garage filled with the low hum of strategy. Maps of the neighborhood spread across the workbench. Laptops glowed with pulled records, and old legal pads filled with notes scrawled in thick pen. We weren't just defending my home anymore. We were defending everyone in Maple Ridge Estates who had been crushed under Barnes' thumb but didn't have the means or the courage to resist. Because I had seen their faces. The older woman across the street, clutching a violation notice with tears streaming down her cheeks. The young couple who whispered to each other on the sidewalk, afraid of drawing attention by parking their car in the wrong direction. The man next door who had stopped planting his beloved rose garden because Barnes threatened him with a fine for unauthorized landscaping. This wasn't just about me. It was about all of them. As midnight crept closer, the garage lights cast long shadows, and I realized something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Retirement had left me restless, unsure of my place in a world that no longer needed courtroom warriors. But now, staring at the determined faces of my brothers and the injustice festering in my neighborhood, I knew exactly why fate had brought me here. Barnes thought he was eroding my freedom, but in truth, he had handed me a mission. By the time the engines fired up again, the plan was set. Eric would dig into the HOA's finances, hacking where necessary, pulling threads that Barnes hoped no one would ever see. Thomas would analyze every number, cross-checking expenditures against receipts, tracing the flow of money like blood through veins. Wallace would prepare the legal arguments, building the case brick by brick so that when the time came we could crush Barnes not just in the court of opinion, but in the court of law. And me? I would hold the line. I would endure every violation, every fine, every act of intimidation, and I would not back down. The neighborhood would watch, and when the truth came out, they would know that resistance was possible. As the last Harley roared down the street, leaving my house bathed in silence once again, I stood in the driveway, breathing in the cool night air. The cracked door behind me was more than damage. It was a symbol. Barnes had crossed my threshold, but in doing so, he had crossed his own point of no return. I glanced at the paper still taped to the splintered wood. Another violation, another threat, another reminder of the war he had chosen to start. My jaw clenched as I pulled it free, crumpling it in my fist. From that night forward, Maple Ridge Estates would never be the same. The HOA had shown its teeth. Now it was time for the Iron Eagles to bear theirs. The first light of dawn crept across Maple Ridge Estates, washing over the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes with a kind of deceptive calm. To anyone passing through, it looked like an ordinary morning in an ordinary neighborhood. But behind closed doors, the Iron Eagles were already at work, dismantling the facade that Leonard Barnes had built. Eric had been up all night. His garage at home had become a war room, the glow of multiple monitors casting sharp shadows across the walls. The man had once tracked international hackers across continents. Now he was combing through HOA records with the same intensity. Passwords were laughably simple, security laughably weak. Within hours, he was inside. What he found didn't just raise red flags. It set off alarm bells. HOA fees had tripled in just 2 years. The reserve fund had ballooned to $500,000. Yet not a single improvement project had been completed. No new playground equipment. No repaved roads. Not even a fresh coat of paint on the community clubhouse. The money wasn't in the neighborhood. It was vanishing into shadows. Invoices appeared for consulting firms with vague names: Sunrise Management, Blue Sky Consulting, Heritage Advisors. But when Eric traced the addresses, they led to vacant lots, shuttered strip malls, or mail drops in faraway cities. Fake companies siphoning real money. The more he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Barnes was laundering HOA funds. Thomas joined him mid-morning, spreadsheets in hand, his analytical mind dissecting every line item. Years in the corporate world had trained him to smell fraud from miles away. He highlighted inconsistencies, connected dots, and built a paper trail that told a damning story. Barnes hadn't just padded his pockets. He had built an empire out of stolen dues, bleeding homeowners dry while hiding behind the cloak of authority. Meanwhile, Wallace prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He reviewed state statutes, HOA bylaws, and case precedents. His careful notes outlined a clear argument. Barnes had exceeded his authority. The break-ins, the fines, the intimidation, they weren't just abuses of power. They were crimes. He wrote with the patience of a man who had once delivered verdicts that changed lives. His plan wasn't just to expose Barnes. It was to strip him of every legal shield he thought he had. I spent the day walking the neighborhood. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for allies. And what I saw broke something inside me. Grace Simmons, the elderly widow across the street, sat on her porch clutching a violation notice, her eyes red from crying. Barnes had fined her for unauthorized vegetation, her garden of wildflowers, the one her late husband had planted 30 years ago. A younger couple down the block had been accused of improper vehicle storage because their minivan was parked in their own driveway for more than 48 hours. Another neighbor had been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines so absurd they read like satire. Christmas lights left up too long, curtains not HOA approved, driveway unwashed. This wasn't just about me anymore. Barnes had weaponized the HOA against his own community, targeting the vulnerable, the elderly, the distracted parents juggling kids and jobs. He bled them with fines, then bought their foreclosed homes through shell companies. The scheme was clear: crush, seize, and profit. When I returned home, the Iron Eagles were waiting. Eric laid out his findings, Thomas added the numbers, and Wallace presented the legal strategy. Piece by piece, Barnes' empire was unraveling before our eyes. The evidence was strong enough to topple him, if we could get anyone to listen. But that was the problem. The local police had already shown where their loyalties lay. When Barnes enforcers had broken into my house, Officer Ramirez had taken a report but no real action. And Barnes had connections, golf buddies, dinner companions, old friends in local government. If we went to them, they'd bury it. We needed a different path. That's when Emily, my daughter, walked into the garage. Sharp as a tack, tough as nails, she had inherited every ounce of my stubbornness. She dropped a stack of papers on the workbench, copies of the HOA agreement she'd pulled from public records. She pointed to the fine print. Barnes and his board had twisted the rules beyond recognition. They claimed powers they didn't legally have, enforcing punishments that weren't enforceable. Every raid, every fine, every foreclosure was built on sand. Her discovery gave us leverage, but it also painted a target on our backs. Barnes wouldn't take this lying down. If he suspected we were onto him, he'd escalate. And sure enough, that afternoon escalation came. 3 men in HOA polos walked the perimeter of my fence, snapping photos like paparazzi. They muttered about unauthorized gatherings as they documented my friends' motorcycles parked in the driveway. I stood firm, but I could feel the shift. This wasn't observation anymore. It was intimidation. They wanted me to know they were watching. That night, as the Iron Eagles grilled steaks in my backyard, the tension was thick. We knew the storm was coming. Barnes wouldn't back off. He'd double down. And sure enough, the next morning, a certified letter arrived. It accused me of running an illegal business out of my home, Apparently, weekend barbecues with my crew now qualified as commercial enterprises. The letter carried a $5,000 fine and the threat of legal action. The words dripped with malice, a clear message. Stop fighting, or we'll bury you. I stood there with the letter in my hands, the weight of it pressing down. Barnes wasn't bluffing. He was tightening the noose. And if I didn't fight back, he'd strangle not just me, but the whole neighborhood. But what Barnes didn't know was that the Iron Eagles had already shifted gears. We weren't just defending anymore. We were preparing to attack. The war against Barnes shifted the moment Eric's discoveries left the walls of my garage. Information was power, but information hoarded was useless. If we wanted to stop Barnes, we had to expose him. The trick was finding someone who couldn't be silenced, bribed, or intimidated. That's where Dana Howard came in. Dana was a local reporter, young but relentless, the kind of journalist who still believed the truth could burn down corruption. She'd built a reputation digging into city contracts and shady council deals, and she had ruffled more than a few feathers along the way. Eric reached out to her quietly, sending a taste of what we had uncovered. Inflated budgets, fake companies, and forged invoices. He didn't give names, not yet. Just enough to bait curiosity. She called within hours. By evening, she was sitting in my garage, notebook open, eyes sharp. As I laid out the story, the violations, the break-ins, the threats, she scribbled furiously, interrupting only to clarify details. When Eric pulled up shell company addresses and Thomas explained how the funds didn't balance, she looked like a predator who had just scented blood. The next morning, the story hit the front page of the local paper, HOA Corruption Rocks Maple Ridge Estates. The headline was bold, impossible to ignore. It named no names yet, but it detailed the fraud in broad strokes. Suddenly, whispers turned into conversations. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for years started talking openly about their own experiences. The HOA's grip of fear loosened, if only slightly, as people realized they weren't alone. Barnes' reaction was swift and predictable. That same afternoon, another violation notice appeared on my door, this one accusing me of inciting unrest. A $15,000 fine followed, absurd even by his standards. But the paper had done its damage. Barnes wasn't just dealing with me anymore. He was dealing with the entire neighborhood, and worse, he was dealing with the public eye. Dana wasn't content with a single article. She wanted proof, documents, photos, testimony. The Iron Eagles provided it all. Eric dumped files onto encrypted drives. Thomas annotated every discrepancy. Wallace drafted summaries that broke down the legal violations in plain English. Dana's second article named names. Barnes was front and center, his empire of fake companies exposed for the first time. The neighborhood erupted. Grace Simmons, the widow across the street, stopped hiding her letters and waved them openly, telling her story to anyone who would listen. The young couple with the minivan spoke to Dana on record, describing their harassment. Dozens of homeowners came forward. Each voice added to the firestorm, and soon Barnes' kingdom was engulfed in flames of outrage. But Barnes wasn't a man to surrender. Desperation made him reckless. He called an emergency HOA meeting, hoping to spin the narrative, to cast me and my crew as troublemakers stirring chaos. The room was packed, every folding chair filled, neighbors spilling into the hall. Dana was there too, notebook poised. Barnes stood at the front, sweating under the fluorescent lights, his voice booming with false confidence. He painted a picture of order under siege, of rules under attack, of an HOA president bravely defending the integrity of the neighborhood against lawless agitators. He called me irresponsible, accused me of leading a gang that terrorized residents, and claimed the fines were justified. But this time, the crowd didn't nod along. They whispered, they frowned, they shook their heads. And when Dana stood and asked if Barnes could explain why HOA funds had been funneled into shell companies with no employees and no services rendered, the room fell silent. Barnes stammered, deflected, and then snapped, accusing her of spreading lies. The meeting collapsed into shouting. Neighbors demanded answers, waving their own notices, their own fines. Barnes pounded the podium, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control. But the more he shouted, the clearer it became. His grip was slipping. That night, retaliation came. I returned home to find my Harley scratched, deep gouges across the chrome. Tools were missing from my garage. The violation taped to my door accused me of improper storage of dangerous equipment. It was blatant vandalism, disguised as enforcement. But this time we were ready. Cameras hidden around my property had captured everything. Barnes' right-hand man, Scott Doyle, had been caught red-handed, breaking into my garage with 2 others. They carried off my television, rifled through my drawers, and left fingerprints on nearly every surface. When the police arrived, they could no longer shrug it off. Cameras don't lie. For the first time, an official investigation began. Officer Ramirez, uncomfortable as ever, had no choice but to take statements. Neighbors gathered in my driveway, watching as the evidence was bagged. The Iron Eagles stood like sentinels beside their bikes, their presence impossible to ignore. Barnes had wanted to humiliate me, but instead, he had exposed his own thugs as criminals. Dana published the footage online. Within hours, it spread beyond Maple Ridge. Comments poured in, outrage spreading across social media. What had begun as a local HOA dispute now looked like a scandal fit for state headlines. Barnes doubled down. He held a press conference outside the HOA office, flanked by board members and a police captain who had long been his golf partner. He blamed me for everything, claimed I had staged the break-ins, accused me of running a smear campaign, and even suggested the Iron Eagles were criminals hiding behind retirement. But the crowd didn't buy it. Shouts of thief and liar drowned out his words. Dana smelled blood and dug deeper. Her next article revealed that the police captain standing beside Barnes was listed as a silent partner in Sunrise Holdings LLC, the very company buying up foreclosed homes in the neighborhood. The corruption wasn't just Barnes. It was systemic. The pressure became unbearable. State officials announced a formal investigation. Barnes and his allies were suddenly under a microscope. His once unshakable authority was crumbling by the day. But even as victories stacked up, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. Cornered animals are the most dangerous, and Barnes was cornered. He had money, he had connections, and he had nothing to lose. And when men like that get desperate, they don't just fight, they strike. For weeks, Barnes had swung at me with fines, raids, and threats. But each blow only revealed more of his corruption. He had underestimated how quickly the neighborhood would turn once the truth came out, how fast loyalty would evaporate when people realized they were not alone in their suffering. But desperate men don't accept defeat gracefully. And Barnes, stripped of his authority, decided to gamble everything on one final move. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, delivered by certified mail. Heavy paper, bold type, language crafted to intimidate. At first glance, it looked like another violation notice. But this one wasn't just directed at me. It was addressed to dozens of residents, each one stamped with the same threat: foreclosure proceedings. Barnes had weaponized debt. He claimed that unpaid fines, some stretching back years, justified seizing homes. The amounts were staggering: tens of thousands of dollars for minor infractions, stacked with interest and penalties. Families who had lived in Maple Ridge for decades, retirees on fixed incomes, young parents just starting out, all were suddenly at risk of losing everything. The neighborhood erupted in panic. Grace Simmons sobbed openly on her porch, clutching the letter as if it were a death sentence. Parents rushed to call lawyers they couldn't afford. Cars lined the streets as neighbors gathered in clusters, shouting, crying, demanding answers. Barnes had struck at the heart of their lives, using the most terrifying weapon he had: the threat of taking their homes. It was no coincidence that Sunrise Holdings LLC, the shell company we had already traced to Barnes, stood ready to swoop in. The plan was simple and ruthless. Barnes would force foreclosures, Sunrise Holdings would buy the properties for pennies, and he would tighten his grip until the neighborhood belonged entirely to him. The Iron Eagles assembled that night in my garage, the weight of the situation pressing down like a storm cloud. Thomas spread the foreclosure notices across the workbench, his sharp eyes scanning every line. Wallace flipped through statutes, his hand steady but his face grim. Eric hunched over his laptop, searching for digital proof that could stop the bleeding. Barnes wasn't bluffing. The paperwork was real, filed with the county clerk's office. The machinery of foreclosure was already grinding into motion. If we didn't stop it, homes would be auctioned within weeks. For the first time since this war began, doubt crept into the room. Could we really stop him? Barnes had money, influence, and an entire system rigged in his favor. We had truth, but truth alone wasn't enough when the clock was ticking. It was Susan, my wife, who spotted the flaw. She sat quietly at the edge of the garage, watching as we pored over documents. Then she leaned forward, her finger tapping a single line buried deep in the foreclosure filings. The debts were based entirely on fines that were themselves illegal. If the foundation was rotten, the entire structure collapsed. Her observation lit a fire. Wallace seized on it instantly. He drafted an emergency injunction, citing state law that prohibited HOAs from initiating foreclosure without legitimate, court-verified debts. Thomas traced the financial path again, showing how every dollar tied back to fraudulent charges. Eric compiled the evidence into a digital dossier, ready to flood every inbox from county officials to state investigators. But paperwork alone wouldn't win this war. We needed exposure. Dana Howard was our weapon, and she wielded her pen like a blade. Her next article was her sharpest yet. HOA foreclosure scheme targets elderly, families, profits tied to President's shell company. The headline exploded across the city, shared online thousands of times. Barnes wasn't just a tyrant anymore. He was a predator. The pressure became unbearable. Television crews rolled into Maple Ridge, their cameras capturing crying homeowners and angry neighbors. Barnes tried to spin the story, holding another press conference, but the questions were sharper now. Reporters demanded to know why Sunrise Holdings shared a mailing address with his wife's business. They asked why fines were triple the county average. They pressed him on why elderly widows were being threatened with losing their homes over wildflowers and wind chimes. Barnes cracked under the spotlight. His voice rose, his face flushed. His hands shook as he accused the media of fabricating lies. But the cameras didn't lie, and the footage of his meltdown only fueled the outrage. State officials announced a full-scale investigation. Barnes' allies began to scatter, each board member distancing themselves, claiming ignorance. The police captain who had once stood beside him was suspended after evidence tied him to Sunrise Holdings. The walls were closing in. But Barnes wasn't finished. Cornered and desperate, he lashed out one final time. Late one night, while the neighborhood slept, a fire broke out at the HOA headquarters. Flames licked the sky, devouring files, shredders, computers, everything that could tie him to his crimes. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was gutted. Barnes stood outside, wringing his hands, pretending to be the victim of an arson attack. But Eric was one step ahead. Days earlier, he had slipped into the office with a key provided by Barnes' own assistant, a woman who had grown tired of his cruelty. He had cloned hard drives, copied ledgers, photographed hidden files. While the building smoldered, the evidence sat safe on encrypted servers, ready to deliver the final blow. The fire was Barnes' confession without words. He was finished and he knew it. But desperate men cling to power until the last shred is ripped away. Barnes still had one card left, one final attempt to claw back control. And when he played it, the entire neighborhood would be caught in the blast. The fire at the HOA headquarters should have been the end of Barnes. For most men, being exposed, cornered, and abandoned by allies would have spelled surrender. But Barnes was not most men. Power had become his drug, and losing it was unthinkable. With the flames still smoldering and reporters circling like vultures, he made his most dangerous move yet. The letters arrived 2 days after the fire. Not fines this time, not violations. These were foreclosure orders, issued en masse, dropped into mailboxes across the neighborhood like bombs. Barnes wasn't waiting for hearings or investigations anymore. He was accelerating everything, trying to seize homes before the state could intervene. He claimed the fires had destroyed records that could have proved compliance, so all debts were now irrefutable. It was madness written on paper, but for terrified families it looked like law. Panic gripped Maple Ridge estates. Children cried as parents argued on porches. Elderly residents whispered about losing homes they had lived in for decades. Neighbors gathered in clusters, waving papers with trembling hands. Barnes had taken fear, weaponized it, and scattered it like shrapnel across the community. The Iron Eagles saw it differently. To us, it was Barnes' final confession. Only a man with everything to lose would risk such an audacious move. Wallace called it what it was: legal suicide. The orders wouldn't stand up in any court. But Wallace also knew fear was powerful. If families packed up and left before the law caught up, Barnes would win by default. We needed to act faster than ever. Eric dug deeper into Sunrise Holdings, tracing connections not just to Barnes, but to a web of associates who had been feeding at the same trough. The files he had copied from the HOA office before the fire became the smoking gun: emails between Barnes and shell company managers, wire transfers disguised as maintenance costs, and purchase agreements for homes seized under false pretenses. It was all there, laid bare in black and white. Thomas pulled late nights, converting the evidence into charts and summaries so clear a child could follow the trail. Money flowed in from dues and fines, vanished into consulting firms, then reappeared as luxury properties and personal accounts. He could prove, beyond doubt, that Barnes had stolen not just thousands but millions. Wallace drafted the injunctions, every page a hammer waiting to strike. He called in favors from old colleagues, judges and attorneys who still respected his word. He knew the law could save us, but only if we moved fast enough to beat Barnes' scorched earth tactics. Meanwhile, I walked the neighborhood, not as a victim but as a rallying point. Neighbors who had once avoided me now sought me out, begging for advice, asking if the rumors were true. I showed them the evidence, assured them we weren't powerless. Hope flickered where fear had taken root. And with each conversation, I felt the tide turning. But Barnes wasn't done with intimidation. That night, as the neighborhood tried to sleep, trucks rolled slowly down the streets, engines idling like predators circling prey. Men in HOA polos walked with flashlights, peering into yards, photographing cars, whispering into radios. It wasn't enforcement, it was psychological warfare. Barnes wanted us to feel hunted. The Iron Eagles didn't flinch. We lined our Harleys in my driveway, chrome gleaming under the streetlights. When the trucks slowed, engines rumbling, we fired ours up in response. The roar echoed through the cul-de-sac, drowning out their posturing. Neighbors peeked through curtains and saw it for what it was. Not just noise, but defiance. The trucks left without confrontation. Their bluff called. The next morning, Dana Howard published her most damning article yet. HOA President Barnes linked to multimillion-dollar fraud scheme. She included charts, photos, testimony, and Eric's damning digital trail. The story spread beyond the city, picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Barnes was no longer a local bully. He was a symbol of corruption writ large. The pressure finally broke through. State investigators announced a raid on the HOA's remaining offices. Barnes' accounts were frozen. Warrants were issued. His allies scattered like rats abandoning a sinking ship. But Barnes himself vanished. No one knew where he had gone. His house sat dark, blinds drawn, car missing from the driveway. Rumors spread. Some said he had fled the state. Others whispered he was hiding in plain sight. The neighborhood wanted to celebrate, but I knew better. Men like Barnes don't disappear quietly. He wasn't finished. And sure enough, his final act came crashing down on us within days. One morning, as the sun climbed over Maple Ridge, trucks rolled into the neighborhood. Not HOA trucks, not contractors. These were bank representatives, foreclosure officers, armed with paperwork Barnes had pushed through before the state froze his accounts. They moved door to door, posting notices, marking homes with fluorescent stickers, preparing for mass seizure. Panic returned in an instant. Families screamed, neighbors begged, children clung to parents. It didn't matter that Barnes was under investigation. The paperwork was real and the process was in motion. If we didn't stop it, half the neighborhood would lose their homes before justice could catch up. The iron eagles assembled in my driveway, grim determination etched on their faces. Wallace clutched the injunction, ready to file at the courthouse. Thomas had financial records stacked in folders, irrefutable proof. Eric had copies of every document uploaded to state servers, impossible to erase. We had everything we needed to win. But winning required one thing, time. And Barnes had made sure time was the one thing we didn't have. That day would decide everything. Either Maple Ridge Estates would be free or it would fall. The morning the foreclosure trucks rolled into Maple Ridge Estates, the air itself seemed to tighten. Their diesel engines growled through the quiet streets, carrying men in pressed shirts and clipboards, eyes cold with the detachment of bureaucracy. They weren't villains in their own minds. They were functionaries just doing their jobs. But to us, to the people who lived here, they were executioners armed with paperwork instead of weapons. Each fluorescent sticker slapped onto a door landed like a death knell. Grace Simmons clutched her chest when one was affixed to her porch. The weight of 30 years in that house threatened with erasure. Young families shouted at the men, waving mortgage statements, pleading for cents. Children cried on sidewalks, watching strangers mark the homes where their childhoods lived. Barnes had lit the fuse, and these men were the sparks running along it. The Iron Eagles didn't hesitate. We weren't going to let the neighborhood fall without a fight. Wallace, still carrying the dignity of a judge even in his biker vest, marched to the trucks with an injunction in hand. His voice, firm and steady, cut through the chaos as he demanded the officers halt their work. The men blinked, startled by his authority, but they had orders. Orders that came from Barnes' poison paperwork. Thomas joined him, thrusting binders of records into the hands of supervisors, page after page of fraudulent charges, fake companies, and illegal fines. His voice sharpened with each word, slicing through excuses with the precision of a man who had spent a career dismantling corporate fraud. Eric, moving like a shadow, streamed everything live. His laptop balanced on his motorcycle seat, his phone broadcasting across the internet. Every notice slapped on a door, every neighbor's tear-streaked face, every line of fraudulent paperwork. It was all captured, shared, impossible to bury. And me. I stood at the center of the cul-de-sac, a foreclosure sticker ripped from my own door crumpled in my fist, and I became the anchor. Neighbors gathered around, forming a circle of resistance. The fear that had splintered them before hardened into defiance. They were done being silent victims. The Iron Eagles had shown them the truth, and now they stood shoulder to shoulder, daring Barnes' machinery to advance. The standoff stretched into hours. The officers stalled, uneasy under the weight of cameras, documents, and outrage. They called their supervisors, who called attorneys, who called the county. What had begun as a simple operation to seize homes had become a spectacle, a courtroom unfolding in the streets, presided over by truth itself. Then came the moment that tipped the balance. A black SUV rolled into the neighborhood, tinted windows hiding its occupants. It stopped at the center of the street, and when the door opened, out stepped Barnes. His face was pale, his suit rumpled, his eyes burning with fury and desperation. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had come to reclaim control. Barnes raised his voice, shouting about order, about compliance, about how every resident here was a criminal squatter defying lawful authority. He waved papers, screamed about debts owed, cursed the media and the Iron Eagles. His words were venom, but his voice cracked under the weight of panic. He wasn't a ruler anymore. He was a tyrant exposed, clawing at scraps of power. Dana Howard, notebook in hand, moved like a predator circling prey. Her camera crew filmed every second as she demanded answers. Why his wife's name appeared on Sunrise Holdings accounts, why the HOA funds had vanished into shell corporations, why he had filed foreclosure orders based on illegal fines. Barnes snapped, veins bulging, sweat pouring down his face as he shouted denials no one believed. Wallace stepped forward, holding the injunction high. His voice, commanding as it had been from the bench, declared that state law nullified Barnes' claims. The crowd roared in agreement. Neighbors shouted their own stories, waving their violation notices, their foreclosure threats, their proof of harassment. The tide had turned fully now. And then came the final blow. Eric broadcast live footage of the files he had pulled from the HOA office before the fire. Emails between Barnes and the police captain, wire transfers to shell companies, property deeds signed in secret. It was undeniable, irrefutable, inescapable. The foreclosure officers froze. Their radios crackled with orders, stand down. The trucks shut off, engines dying like beasts slain. The fluorescent stickers were peeled away, one by one, as neighbors cheered and sobbed in relief. Barnes staggered, his papers falling to the ground, his empire collapsing in front of the very people he had sought to control. But victory wasn't sealed yet. As the crowd surged, as cameras captured his humiliation, Barnes slipped back into his SUV. The door slammed, the engine roared, and the vehicle sped away. He wasn't surrendering. Not yet. And as the dust settled over Maple Ridge Estates, I felt it in my bones. This wasn't over. Barnes still had allies hidden in the shadows, still had money tucked away, still had the desperation of a man facing ruin. He would strike again because men like him always did. The neighborhood was safe for now. But the final confrontation was still waiting, and when it came, it would decide not just Barnes' fate, but the future of everyone who called Maple Ridge Estates home. The neighborhood slept uneasily after the confrontation with the foreclosure trucks. Relief was tempered with dread, because everyone knew Barnes wasn't gone. He had slithered back into the shadows, but men like him never accepted defeat. The Iron Eagles stayed alert, our engines ready, our eyes scanning every corner of Maple Ridge Estates for signs of his return. Came 3 nights later. The sound of tires on asphalt pierced the quiet, heavier than the slow crawl of the foreclosure trucks, more frantic than the usual late-night commuter. From my bedroom window, I saw them. 2 unmarked vans and Barnes' black SUV, creeping into the cul-de-sac under cover of darkness. Doors opened and a dozen men spilled out. They weren't neighbors. They weren't officials. They were hired muscle, fists clenched, faces hard, moving with the aggression of men promised cash and immunity. Barnes had returned for one last strike. If he couldn't crush us with paperwork, he'd try to break us with fear. But he had miscalculated. The Iron Eagles were already waiting. Wallace stood in my driveway, his old judge's posture still radiating authority even as his hands gripped a length of pipe. Thomas was beside him, steady as a rock, ready to defend the neighborhood he had fought so hard to expose. Eric's laptop streamed the scene live to thousands online, his calm voice narrating what Barnes had become. A tyrant who had abandoned even the pretense of legality. And me, I stood in front, leather vest over my shoulders, Harley idling behind me like a steel beast ready to charge. Neighbors stirred. Lights flicked on. Doors opened. One by one, people stepped outside, not with weapons but with resolve. Families who had once cowered behind blinds now stood shoulder to shoulder. Their presence a wall Barnes could not intimidate. What had begun as my fight had become theirs. The neighborhood was united. Barnes emerged from the SUV, his suit rumpled, his tie loosened, his eyes wild. He shouted about order, about property values, about how we were all criminals destroying his vision of Maple Ridge Estates. His words no longer carried the weight of authority. They were the shrill cries of a man unraveling. He ordered his men forward. They hesitated. The sight of dozens of neighbors standing firm, cameras raised, children clinging to parents, and the Iron Eagles planted like sentinels. It broke their resolve. They weren't being paid enough to fight an entire community live on the internet. One by one, they stepped back, their loyalty evaporating. Barnes' fury erupted. He screamed at them, cursed them, kicked the ground like a child denied a toy. But the world was watching. Eric's livestream had tens of thousands of viewers by then, comments flooding in, demanding Barnes' arrest, calling him what he truly was, a predator exposed. And then, the wail of sirens split the night. Police cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing, tires crunching against the pavement. But this time, it wasn't Barnes' allies arriving to protect him. These were state investigators, armed with warrants, their badges shining under the glow of the streetlights. They had seen enough. Barnes tried to bluster, tried to wave papers, tried to claim authority. But his words bounced off the silence of his abandoned men, the steady eyes of neighbors, the unshakable wall of the Iron Eagles. Officers stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. For the first time, Barnes faltered. His shoulders sagged, his face crumbled, and the fight drained out of him. The tyrant of Maple Ridge Estates was led away, his empire collapsing with every click of the cuffs. The neighborhood erupted, not in chaos, but in relief. Cheers broke out, tears flowed, neighbors embraced. Grace Simmons clutched my arm, her voice trembling as she whispered that she could finally sleep without fear. Parents lifted their children high, showing them that the bullies had been beaten. The HOA board dissolved in shame, their signatures now evidence, their power shattered. The Iron Eagles didn't celebrate loudly. We stood together, quiet in the glow of victory, watching the community reclaim what had been stolen. Wallace finally allowed himself a smile, the kind of satisfied grin only a man who had seen true justice could wear. Thomas exhaled deeply, the tension of weeks leaving his shoulders. Eric closed his laptop, the live stream ending with a single, steady message. This is what happens when people refuse to be bullied. For me, it was more than victory. It was vindication. Barnes had tried to strip me of dignity, of peace, of the home I had earned after decades of hard work. But instead, he had united an entire neighborhood. He had reminded us all that freedom isn't given. It's defended. And sometimes, it takes a group of old bikers with gray hair, worn leather, and unbroken spirits to lead the charge. Weeks later, Maple Ridge Estates was transformed. The HOA was restructured, fees slashed, rules rewritten with fairness at their core. Families who had feared eviction found security. Grace Simmons kept her home, her wildflowers blooming brighter than ever. Children played freely, no longer afraid of men with clipboards measuring their joy. And one summer evening, under the soft glow of string lights, the neighborhood gathered for a block party. Tables of food lined the street, music drifted through the air, and laughter replaced whispers of fear. The Iron Eagles stood at the heart of it, glasses raised, engines parked like loyal sentinels watching over the celebration. Grace hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes as she whispered, "You saved us." But I knew better. I hadn't saved anyone. We had saved each other. By refusing to bow, by standing shoulder to shoulder, by daring to fight, we had turned Maple Ridge Estates from a prison into a community again. Later, as the night quieted and the embers of the grill glowed red, Wallace lifted his glass one final time. His words were simple, but they cut deep. To Daniel Carter, too stubborn to quit, even in retirement. Laughter rolled through the crowd. My heart swelled, because stubbornness wasn't a flaw here, it was survival. It was victory. Barnes was gone. His empire was dust. And the Iron Eagles, creaky knees and all, had proven that sometimes the fiercest warriors aren't the young or the strong, but those who refuse to surrender no matter how long the road stretches ahead.